Cheating wife faces unimaginable consequences as husband delivers a shocking surprise mid-affair. Were you aware that the typical high school romance typically lasts approximately 3 weeks? Well, Katie Thomas and Greg Hollander defied that statistic by a whopping 40 years. They first crossed paths when Katie was a freshman and Greg a sophomore. From that moment onward, they were inseparable. Indeed, theirs was a genuine, almost mythical love that endured the trials of time and remained untainted. Interestingly, Kat and I were married for roughly 30 of those years. At the time, I believed our happiness to be genuine. Our marriage brought satisfaction, and the birth of our daughter Joan only deepened our bond. Generally speaking, during those years, I felt content. Allow me to introduce someone who can fill you in on this significant development. I'm Thomas Marsh, and Katie has been my devoted wife for nearly 3 decades. As previously mentioned, Kat and Greg were high school sweethearts, and indeed, she lost her pureness to Greg. It's a known fact that most high school romances come to an end eventually. However, in their case, it seemed more like a temporary hiatus. Since Greg was a year ahead of KTI in school, he aimed to amass wealth after graduation to marry her. This was a narrative my wife often shared throughout our marriage. Following high school, Greg embarked on a pipeline job in Alaska with his uncle, which marked the beginning of trouble. It seems Greg ceased correspondence shortly after arriving, leaving Kat alone during her senior year. She briefly entertained dating someone named Sam or Simpson, but her heart remained steadfastly with Greg. Despite Kat's patient waiting, Greg remained absent and uncommunicative. Evidently, Greg found fulfillment in pipeline work and adopted a somewhat nomadic lifestyle. Convinced that his beloved Kathy was still waiting for him to become affluent and sweep her off her feet upon his return. However, reality painted a different picture. Life moves forward as usual, and nothing remains static. This was true for Katie, who pursued higher education, earned her degree, and crossed paths with me at a party when she was 24. Though I was a bit older at 29, we complemented each other well. I fell for her instantly and believe she felt the same about me. Our marriage was typical, except for a minor hiccup 2 days before our wedding. A letter arrived from Greg, akin to the prodigal son returning home, urging Kat to meet him. Thankfully, Kat's mother intervened, advising her to focus on her new life and not waste time on Greg, whom she referred to as that crap. Following some emotionally charged moments during which I feared Kat might call off the wedding, she went through with it, becoming my wife, Mrs. Katya Marsh. By the time Greg surfaced, we were already on our honeymoon, and in his despair, he apparently enlisted in the Marines. After our honeymoon, we settled into our new routines, with Kat working as a nurse and myself as an insurance adjuster for a major company. While my marriage remained strong, there was one recurring issue. Greg began texting Katie, and she responded willingly. When I questioned the necessity of this, she became defensive, insisting he was just an old friend who needed support, being single and in the Marines, and she was merely writing to uplift his spirits. I cannot claim ignorance, since I was well aware of his consistent correspondence with her and equally aware of her reciprocal letters. Despite efforts from both her family and myself, she persisted until news arrived that he had married someone at his station, putting an end to their communication and restoring my peace of mind. Over the next 3 years, she received just 3 Christmas cards from Greg, and that was the extent of it. During this pause in communication with Greg, our daughter Joan was born. With our newborn in tow, Kathy and I joined forces and diligently worked to build a home and farm to provide Joan with a good life. Those were indeed good days, and we worked together harmoniously to nurture and raise our child. However, as is often the case, a disruption arose. One day, Katie received a letter from Greg. Though she never discussed it, I observed our stamp consumption increasing, leading me to conclude she had resumed correspondence with him. Despite this, I chose to overlook it, considering his duty to protect democracy while I ensured my family's well-being. If they chose to write to each other, I deemed it their business, regardless of my sentiments. Eventually, Kat began sharing with me some tidbits she had gleaned from Greg. He had divorced his first wife but remarried. He had seen combat and was apparently highly decorated. While I listened with only partial attention, Katie spoke with pride about her former Marine. I gently corrected her, reminding her he preferred to be called a Marine, not a soldier. Katie chuckled sweetly and remarked that she should be cautious. Witnessing her discuss him saddened me, yet I held out hope that someday she would move on and focus on our family. Unfortunately, that day never came. Greg had served in the Marines for 30 years, experienced 3 marriages and divorces, and garnered enough medals to rival General Patton. I realized with dismay that while Greg had become more charming to my wife over the years, I had simply grown older and more predictable. My only solace was the hope that Greg, upon discharge, would settle far from us. Regrettably, that was not the case, and here we are now. Our daughter Joan is now a grown woman, married to a wonderful man named Frank Campbell. Even more delightful news is that they are expecting their first child. At 60, I eagerly anticipate reaching the milestone age of 65, when I can retire and enjoy my remaining years in peace and tranquility. Katie still looks as radiant as ever and has the ability to make my heart skip a beat. Little did I realize that the peace in my life would soon be shattered. One Thursday, upon returning home, I found Kat dressed impeccably, informing me of a dinner reservation at 7. Initially perplexed, I searched my memory for any forgotten anniversary or birthday, only to realize that was not the case. So I went along with it, heading to our bedroom to freshen up and attempt to match Kat's elegance. Dinner was fantastic, and the restaurant was crowded, leading me to suspect Kat had more on her mind than just enjoying the food. As we reached the end of our meal, I turned to her and said, "All right, now you can tell me. I'm in a good mood and won't cause a scene." One of my idiosyncrasies is that I never lose my temper in public. Working in the insurance industry teaches you to keep your composure in public, and that habit spills over into my personal life. Kat understood this about me. Over the years, whenever she had something potentially upsetting to share, she'd choose a public setting to break the news. Tonight, I sensed something was off just by looking at her face. After 30 years together, you become adept at reading your partner. I had a sense of foreboding tonight, convinced it would ruin my evening. Finally, with apprehension, she delivered the news. "Tom, I think you should know that Greg is back." I suddenly felt queasy, but I knew it wasn't the food's fault. I stared at her, waiting for more information, but Kat just looked at me thoughtfully. Finally, I broke the awkward silence. "When you say back, do you mean he's back from vacation?" She shook her head and said very quietly, "No, Tom. He's not on vacation. He was discharged from the army and bought a house 2 streets away from us." With that, my panic level began to rise, and I quickly interrupted, "And he's going to live there with his, what, third wife?" And again she said quietly, "No, he got divorced again, but this time he had to lose part of his pension because of her." I tried to suppress my anger, but I couldn't help muttering, "Crap, it's just too much." Some nearby diners looked at me in surprise. My swearing wasn't because Greg had lost part of his pension to his ex, but because he'd moved closer to us, and I needed to understand his motivation for doing so. I became more assertive. "Katie, you haven't met Greg, have you?" The expression on her face answered my question. She didn't even respond when I asked my next question, "When and how did this happen, Katie?" She also looked a little down when she answered, "Yesterday he stopped by our house to tell me that we are now neighbors." My heart was racing and I continued the interrogation, very afraid of what I might find out. "Did you sleep with him, Kat?" Once again, her expression told me everything before she confessed, "I did it, Tom. But it's not what you think." I peered into her eyes and almost growled, "I believe, Kat, that my faithful wife slept with someone other than her husband. Now, explain to me why this isn't what I think it is." "I did it because he needed me, Tom. When he approached me, he seemed so lost. He's struggling with anxiety or something about a divorce, and he needed me desperately, so I tried to help him. I love you, Tom, but I realize I still love Greg too." So there it was. My wife had slept with Greg, and he used PTSD and divorce as his way back into Kat's heart and her bed. I stared her down and spoke as firmly as ever in our marriage. "All right, Kat, the damage is done. We can work through this and reclaim our lives, but you can't sleep with him again. Do you understand?" She looked at me tearfully and said quietly but firmly, "I can't promise that, Tom. I love him, and he needs me more than you." It was shocking to hear those words from her, but a public restaurant wasn't the place for our private turmoil. I signaled the waiter for the bill. 10 minutes later, we were in the car heading home. When I pressed the issue again, "Kat, how can you be with him knowing you have a husband? Have you forgotten the vows we made almost 30 years ago? Remember forsaking all others?" She began openly crying and between sobs confessed, "I'm sorry, Tom, but he needs me and we found each other again. I can't bear the thought of losing him, or you." I was at a loss for what to say or do to make her let him go. With a hint of frustration in my voice, I exclaimed, "Well, what then? Shall we take turns having days off? He gets you for New Year's and I get you for Christmas." "Stop it, Kat. You can't have 2 men." She stopped crying and gazed at me with a peculiar look. "How about a break, Tom?" Now it was my turn to feel embarrassed. "What are you suggesting, Kat?" She changed the subject. "Listen, Tom. Remember about 18 years ago when you took a year off to pursue your master's degree? You did what needed to be done and then returned to your job, and everything was fine." I shook my head irritably. Kat, how can you compare me getting a degree that benefited the family and the company with your involvement with this guy, which only benefits the two of you, at this point? I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. Kat reached out and touched my face lovingly, making her plea. Tom, I missed my last year of high school with Greg, and if I had that year, we might not be facing this situation tonight. Give me this year and we'll get rid of Greg, and I promise to be the best wife to you. I need this time, Tom, please. I experienced a mix of emotions, sadness, hurt, shock, and depression. The urge to grab Katie's neck and squeeze until her eyes dimmed surged within me. However, I recalled stories about prison and how cuckolded husbands forfeited their freedom and property in fits of rage. I stated, "All right, Kat, if this is truly what you desire, feel free to proceed. But it's crucial to note, don't expect my approval. And let me be clear, I don't wish to see or hear from you in any capacity for the entire year. Understand? Also, be aware that in a year you may have no one to return to." I hoped that the strict conditions I set for her vacation might dampen her enthusiasm, but it seemed futile. She appeared deaf to my words after agreeing. After kissing my cheek, she expressed gratitude and assured me that I wouldn't regret it. I shook my head and conveyed that it was too late, and I already regretted it. That night, she desired closeness, but I chose to ignore her. The mere thought of her with Greg made me feel nauseous, and I couldn't bear physical closeness. As we prepared for bed, I grabbed a pillow and informed her I would sleep in the guest room. I noticed this deeply hurt her, and part of me was glad, hoping she might reconsider her plans. The following morning, I woke up hoping that last night was merely an aberration, and that Kat would have a change of heart in the daylight. I was mistaken. Upon entering the kitchen, I found her preparing breakfast, looking as if she just won the lottery. She smiled at me and gestured towards the calendar hanging on our wall. I couldn't help but notice that today's date, June 6th, was encircled by a thick black line. As I sat at the table, I contemplated the irony of this date. In 1944, thousands of soldiers and sailors fought to liberate Europe from tyranny, yet today, I lost my wife to another oppressor. Katie seemed almost giddy as she served me breakfast. Placing it in front of me, she said, "I understand your concerns, my love, but a year from today, I'll return to you and be solely yours. I truly need this time to sort things out and clear my head, and I promise you won't regret it." She smiled contentedly at me before continuing. "I called Greg this morning while you were still asleep and informed him about your permission for my vacation. He'll pick me up in an hour." With every word she spoke, my heart sank, but I felt compelled to give her another chance. "Kat, you don't have to go through with this. I implore you to take more time to reconsider. You can't be certain that in a year you'll be free from him. Focus on freeing yourself from his hold and working on repairing our marriage. I ask you not to risk destroying what we have." She grinned at me with an air of superiority and spoke gently. "Tom, I appreciate the love you've shown by granting me this time. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. Our marriage will be even stronger when I return. Now I need to finish packing, honey, so finish your breakfast." With that, she exited the kitchen, effectively signaling her departure from our marriage. Despite the tasteless meal, I finished eating and proceeded to get dressed. Entering our bedroom, I observed Kat's 3 large suitcases packed with her belongings. She smiled at me affectionately and remarked, "I think I have everything I need. Please, take these bags to the porch for Greg." I stared at her blankly before responding, "No." Her expression shifted to surprise at my refusal. Continuing with my negative response, I added, "Listen, if you're determined to destroy 30 years of marriage, you and that idiot can carry your bags together. I won't assist you in this foolish endeavor, is that clear?" Kat appeared on the verge of tears before retorting irritably, "Greg's not an idiot. Greg is a wonderful man and a hero who served our country. He's done more than you ever have." I turned away, muttering, "Yes, he's received medals. While I've spent 5 days a week working to provide for you and our daughter. You may be right, but it was meaningless." Katie hauled all her luggage downstairs to the driveway, shooting me disdainful looks with each bag she took. Shortly after, a car arrived at our house, and a man whom I presumed was Greg began loading her belongings from our porch. Katie shouted to him that she would be right there before returning to bid me farewell. We stood awkwardly facing each other, and I broke the silence first. "If you're truly going through with this foolish plan, remember the terms. I don't want any contact for the entire year." I could see it was starting to sink in for her as she meekly replied, "I understand, Tom, but everything will work out. You'll see. Remember that you agreed to give me this year." She waited for my response, but I remained silent. Finally, with a more perplexed expression, she said quietly, "I really love you." She leaned in for a kiss, but I turned away at the last moment, so she settled for touching my cheek. Hastily, I stated, "I can't kiss you knowing you're going to him." Tears streaming down her face, she dashed out of the house and into his arms. Standing at the front door, I watched her embrace him passionately, feeling rage surge within me. 2 minutes later, my driveway stood empty, mirroring the emptiness in my heart as I truly realized my wife was now another man's partner. I called in sick to work that morning and promptly went to the hardware store to purchase new locks. Spending the entire morning, I replaced the locks on the house and updated the security codes on the alarm system. Fortunately, it kept me busy and diverted my thoughts from Katie. However, once I finished, the sadness returned, crashing over me like a wave on the shore. Then I resorted to what many would do in such a situation. I turned off our home phone and began heavily drinking. Though intended as a search for relief from the pain of losing Katie, it proved futile. My battle with excessive drinking continued until Sunday morning when I ran out of drinks. A relief, as I felt physically, spiritually, and mentally exhausted. I eventually went to bed and fell into a deep sleep, only to be awakened by a knocking sound in the house. Groggy, I stumbled around trying to locate the source, which turned out to be my daughter, Joan, knocking on the front door. Upon letting her in, she appeared shocked by my condition and the pervasive smell of drinks throughout the house. Her initial words were, "What's going on, Dad?" I struggled to focus amidst the pounding in my head, but managed to respond, "What do you mean?" She regarded me with a puzzled expression before guiding me to the kitchen. "You need coffee and food, Dad. Then you can explain what's been happening." An hour later, with food in my stomach and coffee in hand, I recounted everything I knew about her mother and Greg. To say she was shocked would be an understatement. "Dad, let me clarify, is Mom intending to take a year-long break from our marriage to rekindle things with her old high school boyfriend?" I nodded in agreement, stating, "Yes, something along those lines." Her ensuing questions mirrored the ones I'd been grappling with since Friday. "What's your plan, Dad?" I met her gaze and the words seemed to spill from my lips. "Tomorrow, I'll call in sick again and consult a lawyer." Joan looked saddened and speculated, "I can't believe Mom would do this. Maybe it's a mental disorder?" I responded with a blank expression. "I honestly don't know, Joni." She regarded me with a sorrow I hadn't seen before. "I'm at a loss, Dad. I want to advise you to reconsider, but frankly, this seems like your best option." Joan stayed with me for a few more hours, even preparing dinner for later. As she departed, she kissed me once more and expressed her apologies. Before she left, I inquired, "Why did you come here today?" She looked into my eyes. "Mom called and asked me to check on you, but she didn't explain why or where she was." I nodded, feigning comprehension. "All right, thanks, and drive safely, dear." I felt quite ill on Monday, and also had a meeting with a lawyer. My instincts about Katie were spot on, even though the divorce tilted in my favor due to my spouse's resistance, preventing her from claiming half of my pension. Other shared assets remained unresolved. Now, I'm certain that taking a break from Katie could present an opportunity to settle those assets. The subsequent 3 weeks passed swiftly, and I was surprised by how easily I adapted to solitude. On the positive side, I felt a burden lifted, no longer responsible for another person. However, the downside was waking up and going to bed alone. I didn't hear from Katie until mid-July. One Saturday, I visited Flynn's, an upscale tavern in our city, where I sat at the bar. As they entered, holding hands like infatuated teenagers, their passion for each other was palpable, oblivious to my presence. Observing them closely, I noted Greg's muscular and moderately attractive demeanor, understanding Katie's attraction. Yet he seemed to exert control over her, while she willingly complied with his desires. He spoke, and she listened, focusing on his words. As she rose to head to the restroom, she eventually spotted me at the bar. She offered a timid smile. Upon exiting the restroom, she approached me hesitantly. "Hello, Tom, how are you?" Despite the urge to dismiss her, I maintained decorum and replied, "Oh, as good as one can be when their spouse of 30 years up and leaves for some pervert. What can I do for you?" My sarcastic remark seemed to confuse her, but she stood her ground. "Tom, I need to get into our house. I left some personal items there, but my key didn't work when I tried to enter the other day." I continued to smile and responded in a friendly tone, "Well, Kat, it shouldn't surprise you that your key doesn't work in my house, since you don't live there anymore." She stood there looking at me with a puzzled expression before I spoke again. "I think you better get back to your boyfriend before he gets worried." Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned and walked away, and I returned to the more pressing matter of finishing my drink. 2 minutes later, I felt a rough hand on my shoulder as I was spun around in my chair to face a very annoyed Greg. "Hey, idiot, you made my woman cry, and I don't like it." I felt like he was gearing up to slap me, and my heart raced as I realized he could overpower me before help arrived. Summoning more conviction than I felt, I went on the offensive. You're talking about my wife, not your woman, and since you stole her, you have no say in our affairs. Smack me if you want, but consider the consequences with the cops. I could see the wheels turning in his head, knowing Greg wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. But it spurred me to continue my verbal assault. Now you've got two options. 1, smack me and spend time in prison. Or 2, get out of my sight and sit your foolish self down. My heart pounded wildly, and some part of my brain screamed, why resist? But I maintained a facade of bravery as Greg pondered his choices. Fortunately, at that moment, the manager intervened, asking about the commotion. Greg glared at him before grumbling, no problem, and retreating slowly toward Katie. 5 minutes later, they settled the bill and left. Driving home that evening, I pondered what personal items Katie wanted from the house and resolved to find out. I spent about 3 hours fruitlessly searching until I uncovered boxes beneath her bureau. Underneath them lay letters from Greg addressed to Katie. As I read them, it became clear to me that this affair with Greg had been in the works for years. One letter dated 5 years earlier read, "It's comforting to know you still miss me. When I return, we'll be together. You'll have to find a way to rid yourself of your weak husband." Reading through them all felt akin to flipping through a cheap novel. Many detailed his plans concerning Kat or reminisced about their high school days. By the time I finished, life sans Kat had become noticeably simpler. I didn't hear from Kat until September 1st, my birthday. Upon returning home from work that day, I found a covered dish and a birthday card on the porch. Bringing them inside, I discovered she had prepared my favorite stew. The card wished me a happy birthday, with a note inside reading, "Tom, I know we're not supposed to communicate, but I couldn't ignore your birthday. I dream about us every night, and I know that by the end of this year I will be yours and he will be gone. Please never stop loving me or abandon us." Kat, my daughter Joan, had been keeping a close eye on me since Kat's departure and called me on my birthday. After some small talk, she finally revealed the real reason for the call. "Dad, you know my due date is in 3 weeks, right? How could I forget the birth of my first grandson?" "Yes, I know, honey. You and Frank must be worried." A brief pause alerted me to a potential problem when she continued. "Dad, Frank and I had dinner with Mom and Greg. Mom wants to be there when my baby is born and she wants Greg to be with her. I know you and Mom agreed not to communicate for a year, but could you make an exception for me just this once, please?" Learning that Joan and her husband had dined with them surprised me, but I wouldn't spoil the birth of her first child. "All right, Joan, she can come and she can bring him if necessary." Joan promptly corrected me. "Dad, stop with the name-calling. He's not such a bad guy and he makes Mom happy. I haven't seen her this joyful in years." I was stunned. Then anger surged through me as I retorted, "Your grandmother called him names years ago. Nothing has changed. First, you're all dining together, now you're defending him. I don't know what he's up to, but he's slowly tearing my family away from me." "Just out of curiosity, when are you going to start calling him Dad?" She spoke quickly, regret evident in her voice. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it like that. I can imagine how you feel, and I'm truly—" I interrupted her apology and said coldly, "It's okay. Forget about it. Listen, I have something in the oven I need to attend to. Behave." She said she loved me and hung up. It was probably then that I realized my life would never be the same, and it was time to resist. Firstly, I began liquidating my assets to reduce my worth. Secondly, I shed my fear and re-entered the world. The next days were stressful. First, I received legal advice on asset management from my lawyer. Then, I obtained self-defense insurance in the form of a stun weapon, prepared for any altercation with Greg. Thirdly, I booked a trip to Vegas in October. And fourthly, I sought companionship online, hoping to find a woman my age seeking a stable, long-term relationship. Regarding my possessions, I have the option to utilize them or bestow them to others. Since my spouse doesn't reside with me, it appears to be my responsibility to decide how to divide our belongings. What intrigued me about the situation is the significant flexibility it granted me in shaping my future plans. During Joan's childbirth, I was at my workplace, and my secretary answered the phone. It was her husband, Frank, bursting with joy to inform me that I had become a grandfather. I extended my congratulations and promptly made my way to the hospital. Upon arrival, I located Joan's room and headed straight there. Approaching the door, I overheard her conversation with Katie. "Mom, what you and Dad are doing seems utterly pointless. Do you truly want to lose him to Greg?" Katie's voice was reassuring. "Don't fret, Joan. I won't lose your father. His love for me is too strong for him to ever leave. Besides, what I share with Greg now is incredible. It's difficult to articulate, but every day feels like high school, only better. Now that we can be together physically, He treats me like I'm his princess, and he sweeps me off my feet every night. I've never experienced such incredible closeness in my life. I'll genuinely miss this when I go back to your father." Joan's voice dripped with disdain. "Mom, I don't want to hear about your bed life with Greg. I acknowledge he's an exceptional man and you two seem perfectly matched. But I want my child to have grandparents who are together, not separated or arguing. Please, Mom, you need to return to Dad, and you'd better do it before it's too late. He might be dull and predictable and definitely not in the same league as Greg, but Dad will always be there for you. Greg is undoubtedly a catch, but all ships sail eventually. On the contrary, Dad is a steady presence. He won't abandon you if you do everything right. If necessary, beg him on your knees, but convince him to take you back." There was a brief silence before Joan fervently pleaded, "Mom, don't wait too long or you might lose him." Kat's voice betrayed her misguidedness once again. "You don't need to worry about your father and me. When I'm done with Greg, he'll welcome me back with open arms." Joan's voice held a heavy dose of skepticism. "I understand you think you know Dad, but I've seen and spoken to him and he's changing. And not for the better, it seems. He appears bitter and more distant since you left. Are you really willing to risk our good 30-year marriage for your high school sweetheart?" Having heard enough, I seized the opportunity to enter the room and exclaimed with a forced smile, "Hey, Mom. Congratulations on your new son. You two must be thrilled." I went over and embraced Joan, pointedly ignoring Katie. It was immature of me, but it seemed easier at that moment. Katie shot me a dirty look, but Joan beamed as she asked, "Have you seen him yet, Dad?" I shook my head. "No, sweetie, I just came to check on you." Eventually tired of the insults, Katie intervened in a less than friendly tone. "Hello, Tom. How are you?" I glanced at her for a moment, then redirected my focus to Joan, inquiring about the birth and the baby's name. At the mention of the name, Joan's face lit up and she exclaimed happily, "Frank and I both agree. We want to name our baby Thomas after you, Dad." At this, Katie solemnly excused herself, stating she was going to see the baby. Once she left, I took Joan's hands and spoke in a serious tone. "Joan, you know your mom and I probably won't reconcile." I could see my words hit her hard. "No, Dad, I don't believe that. She'll come to her senses soon and come back home." My eyes welled up as I continued. "Baby, I now realize I was never enough for your mother. Something will happen soon." Shock and disbelief crossed her face. "What?" I smiled sadly. "In the near future, I'll begin divorce proceedings after I sort a few things out." But tears filled her eyes as she spoke. "Oh, Dad, I told Mom she should plead for you to return, but it's too late now, isn't it?" I nodded in agreement. "Yes, I won't be able to reconcile with her. The memories of her betrayal would be too much for me. But please don't say anything to her yet, all right?" She nodded and drew me in for a kiss. We chatted for a few more minutes about various topics, purposefully avoiding any mention of my wife or her lover. Finally, I promised to return the next day and left her to admire the baby. Navigating to the children's ward, I found my grandson among numerous other babies. I was struck by how small and precious he was, realizing the beauty in the moment. Frank approached me, standing between Katie, Greg, and myself. With a smile, he handed me a cigar. "Here, Dad, smoke to celebrate." I tucked the cigar into my pocket and gave Frank a pat on the back. "I'll save this for later, son. Thank you." Watching my wife and her lover holding hands like teenagers made me feel nauseous. "Listen, Frank, I'll come back tomorrow when it's less crowded and the air is fresher, if you catch my drift." Frank smiled knowingly. "I completely understand, Dad, and I don't blame you one bit." As I prepared to leave, Kat timidly called out to me, "Gosh, Tom, it feels like just yesterday we were bringing our baby home. And now it's surreal that our baby has one of his own. Time flies, but it flies too fast." I glanced at her, still hand in hand with Greg, and left the room without a word. She looked puzzled as I left them standing there. October arrived, turning out to be my best month since Katie's departure. I ventured to Vegas with the intention of hitting the tables and losing as an excuse to diminish our shared assets. However, what made the trip truly enjoyable was the woman I encountered there, Miranda, a mature woman around 50. She surprised me with her continued profession, explaining that many men seek an older woman, and in my case, she was right. Miranda was pricey, but she made me feel more alive than I had in years. For the first time since Katie left, I didn't really miss her at all. Miranda was skilled both in and out of bed, and she showed a genuine interest in me, probing for details about my soon-to-be ex-wife and her new partner. Before the night concluded, Miranda knew as much about me as I did. Moved by my story, she gently caressed my face before departing. "Tom, I've only known you for a few hours, but I feel compelled to tell you something. You're a good person, and that's a rare find." Believe me, as I've seen and been with thousands of men, I can count on one hand those I truly liked and respected. You're one of them. Your wife has no clue what she's letting go of. However, don't let her actions and foolishness change who you are. And if you ever find yourself back in town, give me a call because I'd love to see you again. Miranda and my Vegas trip left me more bewildered than when I first arrived. Mulling over Miranda's words, I came to the realization that she was correct. Despite Kat's 3 decades of being a devoted wife and mother prior to her betrayal, I was set on seeking vengeance. No, I refused to let this marriage leave me broken. Upon my return from Vegas, I instructed my lawyer to begin drafting divorce papers. Additionally, I resolved to gather more information about Greg Hollander. Acting on my lawyer's recommendation, I hired a firm to delve into his background from high school to the present. Despite the firm's hefty fees, I didn't hesitate, knowing half the expenses would be covered by Katie's share. Assured of the firm's thoroughness, I was confident they'd provide all necessary information before Christmas. I also broached the topic of transferring to a branch office of our company with my boss. Initially taken aback, considering my previous aversion to relocating, my boss promised to look into it and inform me. Thanksgiving loomed as the next obstacle I had to confront. Joan called me about a week before the holidays to invite me to dinner with them. When I inquired about her mother and her companion's presence, she hesitantly confirmed they would be there. Upon hearing this, I firmly declined and ended the call. Surprisingly, my brother-in-law reached out to me. Subsequently, Frank called my office and requested a meeting. We agreed on a time and met at a conveniently located bar in the city center for a quiet drink that evening. I noticed Frank was agitated. After exchanging initial pleasantries, I ordered 2 double scotches. Sensing something was bothering my son-in-law, I sat back and listened as Frank confided in me about what was happening with my wife and daughter. "Dad, you won't believe it, but they're both infatuated with him. It's all Greg this and Greg that." "You'd think he was the guy from the beer commercial, the most interesting man in the world," Frank said before taking a sip of his drink. I was surprised by his frankness and began to wonder why he had come. To persuade me to attend Thanksgiving? I needed to understand, so I asked, "Do I understand correctly, Frank, that you don't approve of dear Mr. Hollander?" Frank looked at me with evident anger. "Dad, this man is arrogant, self-centered, selfish, and worse. He's so in love with himself that I can't fathom where he has any room left for Katie." Realizing his outburst, his expression shifted to one of remorse, and he quickly retreated. "Sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to disrespect." I reassured him with a smile. "No worries, son. Don't be offended. When did you start calling her Katie instead of Mom? You seemed devastated when she left you. Since then, I've lost all respect for her." Now I was curious. "Why did her departure affect you, if I may ask?" His face flushed with anger once more. "I'm sure you noticed during the time I was with Joan that I never discussed my parents with you guys. And I appreciate that you never inquired about them. The truth is, my mother cheated on my father. After that, they split, and my father never recovered. He drank himself into oblivion, and my mother died in a car accident with her lover. I despise cheaters, and now that Katie has become one, I can't stand her anymore. I'm pretending for Joan's sake, but I'm worried." I had never heard about Frank's parents before and empathized with his pain. Yet I was also intrigued by his apprehension. "Frank, you mentioned being worried. What's on your mind, son?" He took a deep sip from his glass, ordered another, then turned to me. "I might upset you with this, but you asked. The saying, like mother, like daughter, worries me. If Katie has turned into a cheater and keeps praising it to my wife, how long before Joan gets tempted to stray too?" My eyebrows lifted at his concern. "I see where you're coming from." I joined him, taking a contemplative sip of my drink, pondering my next steps. "Listen, Frank, don't lose hope. I have some surprises up my sleeve, and I think things might start to change in the new year. Also, strictly between us, I've got plans to make it a good Christmas for you and Joan, but not so much for the others, if you catch my drift." Frank's smile emerged for the first time since we sat down, and he spent the next 15 minutes trying to pry information from me, to no avail. As we wrapped up our meeting, I smiled again. "Aren't you forgetting something, Frank?" He looked puzzled. "What, Dad?" I put a hand on his shoulder. "Shouldn't you try to persuade me to be a big boy and attend Thanksgiving?" Frank's smile widened. "Oops, okay, will you come to Thanksgiving, Dad?" I shook my head in response. "No, but I appreciate the invite." Joan called me twice more before Thanksgiving, pleading for my attendance, until I finally put my foot down. "Look, Joan, when your mother left me back in June, I made it clear there'd be no contact for a year. She wanted to end our marriage. I've already broken that rule once for little Thomas's birth, but I won't break bread with them. Is that understood? The holiday arrived, and I had a frozen dinner. I felt lonely and sad, but it beat watching Katie and Greg exchange looks. December arrived, bringing with it the looming prospect of another family holiday. I dreaded it, but I knew it'd be the last one I'd have to endure. December turned out to be eventful. Firstly, the company offered me a position in Spokane, Washington, starting in January, and I accepted. Secondly, the private investigator's report on Mr. Hollander came through, and it was revealing. Apparently, old Greg had a history of infidelity, with 3 ex-wives divorcing him for infidelity. He also had children from women other than his wives, for whom he paid child support. Furthermore, his last wife received half his pension in the divorce, and he was demoted from an E8 to an E6 in his final year in the Corps. In short, his financial and moral standing appeared rather dubious, if not downright dismal. The latest positive development is that Katie will receive her divorce papers on the first business day after Christmas. Ah, now the old holiday spirit was coursing through me. I called Joan to discuss Christmas plans, and once again she pleaded for a true family gathering. When I inquired about Greg's attendance, Joan became irate. "Dad, you need to accept it. He's part of our family now, whether you like it or not." I cut her off abruptly. "Right, I don't like it, but for the child's sake, I'll be there." Joan appeared genuinely pleased as she exclaimed, "Thank you, Dad. This will make everyone so happy." I doubted that would be the case, but who was I to spoil the fun? 2 days later, upon returning home from work, the phone rang and instinctively I answered. "Hello?" The line remained awkwardly silent, and I almost hung up when a voice finally responded. "Tom, it's me, Kat." "What's wrong, Kat? Are you hurt?" Her voice sounded hesitant. "No, I'm fine, Tom, but I wanted to thank you for agreeing to come for Christmas. I realize now how much I've hurt you. We've never spent a holiday apart in 30 years. I was miserable at Thanksgiving, living without you, and I've been reminiscing about us so much lately." I cut short her nostalgic trip. "Well, Katie, I'm glad to hear you reflect on us. However, I must remind you that when you initiated this separation, I insisted on no communication between us. I made an exception for Christmas Day, so I believe we should end this conversation now. Goodbye." After hanging up, I felt awful. I had never spoken to her so harshly in our entire 30-year marriage. But as guilty as I felt about my words, it didn't compare to the day she left me. The month passed slowly, allowing ample time for Christmas shopping. I made sure to buy gifts for everyone. Additionally, I packed belongings for my new job and rented a car for the cross-country drive. I also conversed with a helpful woman at my new office, who informed me she had selected a few well-appointed furnished apartments near the office. The pleasant surprise was that she would personally show them to me upon my arrival in Spokane. Yes, everything was falling into place for me. Arriving at Joan and Frank's on Christmas Day in December, I discovered Katie and her partner had already arrived. Joan warmly embraced me, commenting on the surprise before returning to dinner preparations. I smiled inwardly, thinking, if only she knew what a true surprise this was. Frank greeted me, taking my coat as I quickly inquired, "Can I see my grandson?" Frank nodded, mentioning the baby was asleep in the nursery, but I could visit quietly. I entered and observed the sleeping figure before me, a surge of emotion washing over me. Aware that soon I would depart but unable to stay, I sensed movement behind me. Katie silently approached and stood beside me. I couldn't help but feel the irony that she should have been here since June. Katie whispered, "We have a wonderful grandson, Tom." Filled with sadness, I replied, "Yes, Katie, but who will he call Grandpa? Me or the fool or both?" Katie seemed taken aback. "Why would you say that? You're the only grandfather this child will ever have, Tom." I murmured quietly, "Let's hope you're right, Katie," and then I left the room. The following hours were filled with conversation between Frank and me, while Joan, Katie, and Greg appeared lost in their own world. I was disappointed at how quickly my daughter fell for Greg's charms. Frank seemed equally unhappy, but I reassured him, promising changes that night. His eyes gleamed as he whispered, "I hope so, Dad. I can't stand that fool around her anymore. At this rate, he'll soon be cozying up to Joan." Dinner was served, and although the food was delicious, the company was lacking. Once again, I felt no desire to converse with my wife or her partner, and Frank seemed hesitant to speak up as well. The only one who spoke was Greg, regaling the women with tales of his bravery. Watching Greg with his small fan club made me feel sick. After dinner, Joan brought the baby into the living room, and we all gathered together. Observing my family, I realized this might be the last time we shared such a moment. Joan seemed happy as she eagerly instructed Frank to distribute gifts. When he did, Joan gave her mom, Greg, and me presents. Katie received a sweater, Greg a gift card, and I received a tie, practical yet uninspired gifts, much like how my wife and daughter perceived me. When Frank, Joan, and the baby unwrapped their presents from Katie and Greg, Joan smiled and laughed, while Frank remained polite but distant. Once everyone finished opening their gifts, the room fell a bit silent, all eyes turning to me and my bag of presents. Breaking the silence, I declared, "To conclude this wonderful weekend, I want to give you all the gifts you deserve for this holiday." Standing up, I retrieved the bag I had brought and handed Frank and Joan a large envelope wrapped in festive paper. Joan eagerly tore open the wrapping while Frank observed. As Joan sifted through the papers inside the envelope, her joyous scream filled the room upon realizing its contents. Katie shifted in her seat, eager to learn what the papers held. Waste no time, Joan filled her in, exclaiming, "Mom, Dad gave us your house for free. No mortgage. Now we can move out of this rental. Isn't that amazing?" Katie's expression faltered as she looked to me with concern. "Why did you do this, Tom? Where will we live?" I shot her a piercing look, hoping to convey my feelings. "Don't fret, Katie. I've thought of everything. Here, this is for you." Handing her a card in a wrapped box, I watched as she tore open the paper, revealing a bracelet inside. Surprise painted her face as she pulled it out, prompting me to say, "Take a look at the inscription I wrote." Observing Greg's displeasure at her gift, Katie turned the bracelet over, revealing the words, "Thank you for the best 30 years of my life, Tom." I glanced at Greg, noting his frown, while Katie appeared puzzled. "Tom, thank you, dear. This is lovely, but you forgot to write 'with love.'" I offered a smile. "I didn't forget, Katie. I simply chose not to lie. My love for you has been fading steadily in recent months. This bracelet is my farewell and a reminder of what you sacrificed for your partner. Also, you'll receive divorce papers on Monday." I heard Joan inhale sharply while Katie's face twisted with disbelief and despair. Nodding towards the postcard in the card, I continued, "I attempted to express gratitude for the wonderful years and our daughter. There's also a check for half our liquid assets, though it's not much, $195 spent during your absence. The house was intended for my daughter when you left our marriage," explained further in the card. Turning to Greg, I anticipated the brewing storm. "This gift is for you as well." Handing Katie another large envelope, she looked stunned. "Inside is the full account of what your lover has been up to since your high school split. I believe you'll find it an interesting read." Before I could finish, Greg erupted, threatening, "I'll ruin you, you son of a cow." Greg collapsed to the floor with a thud as my stun weapon made contact, ensuring he remained incapacitated. Joan and Katie stood up, and I administered another 2 shocks to Greg's groin area, just to ensure he stayed down. Moving closer to him, I remarked, "Feeling the pain? Well, let me tell you. Your agony is nothing compared to losing the woman I cherished for 30 years to scum like you." Katie sobbed as if the world was ending. When I turned to her, I said, "I know I'm not as exciting as your sergeant, but I won't forget what you did." I administered another shock for good measure, relishing in his convulsions. "This never gets old." I glanced back at Katie, summoning more bravado than my shattered heart allowed. "Anyway, since you seem to enjoy this affair, I'm giving you the ultimate gift, Katie, freedom. Now you can live your life being pampered by day and entertained by night. Perfect for a traitor like you, isn't it?" Katie struggled to speak, choking out, "No, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. I was going to come back to you in June, Tom. I love you." She trembled like a leaf in a storm as Joan rushed to console her. I zapped Greg once more before Frank intervened nervously. "You shouldn't do that again, Dad. You might wreck, run him." Standing over my convulsing nemesis, I looked at the 2 women I loved more than anything. "I'll leave now. Thanks for the lovely day and the wonderful life, as I likely won't see you again, possibly ever." Both women were speechless, staring at me as if I were a stranger. Frank handed me my coat with a satisfied grin. Before leaving, I addressed my daughter, who looked at me with fear for the first time. "Joan, take this as a lesson. If you follow your mother's path, you'll suffer just like she did. You'll lose everything, your husband, your home, your possessions, and the love of your life." Approaching little Tom's crib, I touched his cheek and whispered, "Goodbye, baby. Maybe we'll meet again someday, but I doubt it." Still smiling, I left for the door, bidding the silent room, "Happy New Year, everyone." By the time I reached my car, the shock had likely worn off for the women, or maybe Greg had recovered. But I distinctly heard one desperate voice cry out, "No! This can't be happening to me." Starting the engine, I thought about Vegas on my way to Spokane, where seeing Miranda again wouldn't be unwelcome. As I backed out, Frank emerged from the house, smiling and waving, and I returned the gesture before driving off into a new life out west.